I'm going to begin this morning with a reading from the book of Ecclesiasticus, which is not the same as Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiasticus is probably a book that many of you have not heard of, and I will explain why in a little bit. But to begin from Ecclesiasticus 6, let those who are friendly to you be many, but 1 in 1,000 your confidant. When you gain friends, gain them through testing, and do not be quick to trust them. For there are friends when it suits them, but they will not be around in time of trouble. Another is a friend who turns into an enemy and tells of the quarrel to your disgrace. Others are friends, table companions, but they cannot be found in time of affliction. When things go well, they are your other self and lord it over your servants. If disaster comes upon you, they turn against you and hide themselves. Stay away from your enemies and be on guard with your friends. Faithful friends are a sturdy shelter. Whoever finds one finds a treasure. Faithful friends are beyond price. No amount can balance their worth. Faithful friends are life-saving medicine. Those who fear God will find them. Those who fear the Lord enjoy stable friendship, for as they are, so will their neighbors be. Personally, I love cold weather, but my cameras not so much. A number of years ago, I was making pictures of Wilmington College students in the sheep barn during their January lambing season. Some nights I didn't know whether I would have enough battery power in my camera bag to last a 4-hour shift. And it's not because I didn't charge the batteries earlier in the day. It's because cold can be that hard on batteries that they simply cease to function. So as the cold of winter approaches every year, I spend a lot of time thinking about batteries. And every so often it occurs to me, and then I forget by the next year, but every so often it occurs to me that our spiritual lives, how we feel God's nearness to us and our sense that we participate in the sacred, our spiritual lives can be like my batteries in cold weather, energized but non-functioning. I've spoken before about building our spiritual lives through the use of spiritual practices. Prayer, contemplation, devotional reading, a daily examination of conscience, silence, weekly worship. All of these things help sharpen our awareness of our own place in the life of God, our sense of being immersed in the living stream of God's love and concern. But it seems to me that there are also times when we carry out all the practices that have kept us in touch with God, and yet they lack punch. Our basic contact with God is there, our faith is there, but we don't necessarily feel encouraged or supported. We maybe don't feel any difference at all. We don't lack faith and we're not mired in doubt, but we also don't feel spiritually warm. Sometimes our faith doesn't make much difference to either the way we live our lives or the way we perceive them. Sometimes our spiritual lives are like my camera batteries struggling in the cold. The problem for my batteries isn't that they don't have energy in them or that they have been charged. The problem is that their situation, the environment they find themselves in, drains the energy from them and keeps them from functioning. The same thing can happen in our lives. During that time that I spent in the Wilmington College lamb barn, I started experimenting with ways of keeping my batteries warm. The method of least effort is to stash them in the inside pockets of my coat next to my body, but that depends on whether I have a coat with inside pockets. It limits my access to them sometimes, and it especially gets confusing when I have to separate the used batteries from the fresh ones. So then I discovered these little chemical hand warmers called hot hands, or hot pockets, not hot hands. You've probably seen them. They're about this big, and you can find them in a hardware store or at the checkout stand. You can get 2 packets for $1. You might even use them yourself during cold weather. You rip open the foil covering, you shake the fiber pouch, and the air causes the iron powder inside them to heat up. Not blazing, painful heat, just steady, warm heat for 8 hours or so. Now, if I'm going to be photographing outside in the winter, I stick one of these little hot hands packets into my battery compartment when I go out, and the batteries that are charged in my bag stay warm and ready till I put them in the camera. And it makes me wonder, what is the equivalent of hand warmers for my spiritual life when my spiritual life is lacking energy? What might keep my spiritual life warm and reliable at times when it is present but ineffective? There might be a dozen answers, but the one that occurs to me first is friendship, especially spiritual friendship. The reading I began with from Ecclesiasticus is probably one you haven't heard, because Ecclesiasticus is one of the books included in the Catholic Bible, but not the Protestant Bible. And I could spend half an hour explaining how and why that happened, but that would be a Bible lecture, not a message for worship. The short explanation is that when most of the area that we now call the Middle East, as well as the Mediterranean and Northern Africa, fell under Greek rule and then Roman rule, many Jews began to speak and write in Greek. What they wrote in Greek during that period of time largely falls into 2 categories: apocalyptic literature, which draws a sharp distinction between the present corrupt world and a coming future world which will be perfect, and in which God's own people will finally gain victory over all those who've persecuted them. The other main category of Jewish literature written in Greek falls into what's called the wisdom tradition, short proverbs or lengthy essays on how to live a good life in the midst of a foolish world. This Jewish Greek literature was considered part of Jewish scripture at the time of Jesus, but after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, when the Jewish people were forced out of Israel, they had to find ways to create an identity that didn't depend on Jerusalem and didn't depend on worship at the temple in Jerusalem. This period of Judaism is called Rabbinic Judaism, and one of the decisions Rabbinic Judaism made was that anything written in Greek wasn't Jewish enough to be part of the Holy Scriptures. So Jewish literature written in Greek was set aside in a special category of its own, instructional and useful, but not scripture. The early Christians, though, were used to a version of Hebrew scriptures that contained the Jewish literature written in Greek. So they retained those books in their scripture until the time of the Protestant Reformation. One of the things about wisdom literature is that it is more focused on daily living than it is on history. It's not about the special, unique things God is doing or has done. It's about how to be a good person, especially a wise person in daily life. As opposed to the prophets and the Gospels, wisdom literature isn't turned against the world as it is in favor of the world as it could be, as it ought to be, as God originally intended it to be. Wisdom literature says, this is the way the world is, and this is the way you make your peace with it. And as my Old Testament professor sometimes said, wisdom literature represents the only really peaceful part of the Bible. Anyway, I picked up a Bible on retreat one week and then flipped it open with no intention, and this passage from Ecclesiasticus is where I landed. It caught my attention immediately because of the importance it places on friendship. Friendship is something so crucial to us and so close to us that I think we can rarely speak about it with any understanding. We can talk about marriage and family because we understand the biological necessity upon which they rest. But friendship isn't a biological necessity. It just happens to be a spiritual necessity. We need others to help us know ourselves. need friends, trustworthy friends to love us, to reflect back to us honestly who and how we are. We need friends for physical support when the house floods or the harvest fails. We need friends to sit beside our hospital bed and keep us from loneliness and fear. I think one reason that we get confused about friendship is because we know there are all kinds of friends. There are friends who are really acquaintances, people we can have fun with, but with whom we don't share the details of our lives. There are work friendships and sports team friendships. There are all the kinds of shallow friendships that the author of Ecclesiasticus warns us against, like the friend who will eat at your table but not stay around in your time of trouble. Some teachers consider a kind of friendship called spiritual friendship to be another kind of spiritual practice. And I agree that it can be. There are certain kinds of guidelines or rules for how you practice spiritual friendship. But I also believe that any good, intimate friendship has the potential to become a spiritual friendship. In any close friendship, two people will share what is most important in their lives: hopes, dreams, fears, and concerns about relationships, as well as details of their everyday lives. In a spiritual friendship, two people may also share such things, but in addition to those questions, there will be a focus on each person's relationship with God. John Wesley used to ask, "How is it with your soul?" That's a good starting point for a spiritual friendship. So one option is to seek out friends with whom you want to intentionally share this practice, and be intentional and say, we're meeting for coffee with attention to how it is with our souls. But another option, and I think it's probably the option more open to most of us, is to be willing to go deeper with the friends that we already have, and to be willing for them to go deeper with us. To find the courage to ask, how is it with your soul? And by soul in this context, I think we mean that part of ourselves that searches for purpose and meaning, that thinks about our connection to the universe as a whole, whether we're connected or whether we feel disconnected. We can be friends who ask, as we listen to someone's joy or someone's trouble, in these things, where are you experiencing God's presence? And I think the thing about belonging to a group like a meeting is that it can be a safe place to think that people will be willing to answer some of these questions, to answer the question, or at least to entertain the question, how is it with your soul? I don't know if I can ask that question in my workplace, but I should be able to ask that question of someone at meeting. Where are you experiencing God's presence these days? Or alternatively, where are you not experiencing God's presence these days? Worshiping with each other, studying with each other, seeking God's leading together as we do in meeting for business. They also provide the ground on which we can assume that someone will be willing to engage in that level of discussion. I think at any rate, that's what we hope will happen, that we will be able to talk about that connection that we have to the miracle of creation. I think what it requires is for each one of us to be willing to be courageous enough to ask, how are you really? And to be vulnerable enough to answer how we really are. And I think that's the equivalent of my little pocket hand warmers from my camera batteries. Coming to meeting not only to be with God, but to be with my friends.